celebrate the 60th anniversary of that program. And I had to do some research to find out, I'm a historian by training, how UCEAP came about and what the initial mission was, and then came upon, with the help of Elizabeth, Bill Always booked the Global Campus, which was not something that I had known before, and also about his vision that the University of California would be a global campus, right? That students would be able to go abroad and get credit for their courses at partner institutions directly enrolling, as opposed to being led by UC faculty, and the way that that would open up just all kinds of possibilities. So in some ways, I'd like to do both, kind of tell you a little bit about my personal biography and my intellectual biography, because I think that they're really intertwined, and how I do feel like the world has been my campus to a certain way, both formal and informal education. So this idea of global journeys is just at the core of who I am, because I was born in Haiti, immigrated to the US when I was in elementary school with my parents. And so I already made that journey in terms of thinking about cultural adaptation. And as I'm sure many of you in this virtual room right now who have immigrant backgrounds wherever in the world that you're from, know that for immigrants, it's usually education is your path up, right? And it's like the key. And so for my parents, this idea that you do well in school was very, very key to our kind of growing up. But one of the things that I remember that was a parallel to that was the public library. So my mom would take my brother, she would take us every week to the public library, and she would just leave us there for hours. And I think that was just her way to get a break from us. But I think for me as a child growing up in these suburban spaces where I was often the only one who looked like me, the library just opened up all these immense possibilities of places where we couldn't travel to because we didn't have enough money. I just remember reading books like Tessa the D'Urbervilles about, rural Ireland and all these other places. And that was really an opening for me. And I just always remembered that I wanted to go to those places. So when as a high school student in Miami, Florida, which was very much an immigrant enclave, I had classmates who were from Guatemala and Haiti and Jamaica and very few Americans. I remember that I got this postcard in the mail, and this was when college admissions was still done through the mail, from this institution where they featured a woman of undeterminate class, ethnicity, who was walking under these Gothic arches. And the saying on this postcard was, the purpose of a liberal arts education is to open up, to make your head a more interesting place in which to live for the rest of your life. And this was 1991, and I still remember this, and I said, that's where I'm going. And that place was Bryn Mawr College. And when I see that president, and I still tell her decades later that I remember this, that's really key. And yet at Bryn Mawr, I made another journey, because this was a place of such privilege, of places of, there were heiresses in my classes, people who were, the heiresses to fortunes, people who had this term that I just learned a few days ago in traveling to the UC SoCal campuses with the other associate dean, Peter Graham, of continuing generations of college. And I found out that there was this other piece of college, what I'm now calling the hidden curriculum, that I think many first gens don't know, and that is education abroad. That it's not just going on your campus, but it's also education abroad. And that sense that I learned from my classmates, that not only had they spent all their family vacations, going to Switzerland and all these places I'd never been to, but this was baked in. So then as a French and history major, I said, I'm going to do that too. And Bryn Mawr had a program that was based in Avignon in France, a very conservative city in the 1990s in terms of thinking about the south of France being the birthplace of the Le Pen party that is now considered the far right in France. But I was going to go there, and that was just my dream. So I remember as a first generation Pell Grant student, working extra hours, my family kind of scraped and, all this money, and together collectively, we had just enough money to go. But I had a barrier in going to France. And this is when, as a green card holder and a non-US citizen, I couldn't just go on the plane. I had to first take a train all the way down to the the French embassy in Washington, D.C. to have an interview where I had to show proof that I had a bank account and all these other things, and I wasn't just going to go to France to immigrate and to stay. So this was yet another barrier, but yet I got there. And so as a person who was in France, and I felt just so proud and so opened, and I was just wowed by all I was experiencing, I also discovered as I was walking through Avignon that people would often stop me and say, "What are you doing here?" As if I didn't belong, and that I shouldn't be there. And so I just remember constantly kind of fighting that. And I remember being very proud at the end when I would go to the markets, and there was this seller, this person who sold kind of butchery meats, who said to me at the end of that summer, "You have the accent of the region now, the way in which you say things. You have the kind of, there's a sing-song way in which people in the south of France speak." And that's when I felt like I finally belonged from there. And so just one other anecdote that I'll tell you, though, is when I got back to Bryn Mawr in my senior year, and I applied for this fellowship called a Watson Fellowship. That was an amazing fellowship to have, because you literally carve out a project and you go do it anywhere in the world. And it was upon returning to Bryn Mawr that I realized that with all of my kind of global forays, whether it's physical travel or through books, I had never, ever taken a class on Africa, didn't know very much about Haiti, because the idea was that the place that has history is Europe or the US. And so I applied for this fellowship to go travel through West Africa for a year through the lens of slave tourism. But one of the things that occurred to me in that year that is one of my professors, a person whom I adored, took a lot of Western Civ classes, shared a letter of recommendation that he wrote for me. And in that letter of recommendation, he wrote about how, it's so fascinating and interesting how this student who is from Haiti can somehow write with great depth about people like Thomas Aquinas and all the 12th century, martyrs, early Christians. And I think he thought he was paying me a compliment. But really, I did not read it as a compliment, because what I was reading is that someone of my identity, of my demographic categories, should somehow not be able to write with such depth and with such empathy about people in places that did not match my demographic identity. So I think I tell you the story to say that the ways in which I've kind of had this intellectual and personal arc is through the way in which an actress, America Ferrera, did a really lovely TEDx talk in which she talks about how my identity is my superpower. My identity as a Haitian American Black woman who works on France and Haiti and Africa, my identities are my superpower. So identities, plural. And the ways in which I can inhabit all of those personal intellectual identities as I traverse through the globe, I think is the power of international education, and one of the things that I tried to say. So to a certain extent, this journey, if you will, from the US to studying France to now being a scholar of West and West Central African history is very infused by my own personal journeys and my own personal forays, if you will, through thinking about these global identities. So I'll tell you how that informs what I do for a living, which is being a historian of Africa. And here, I'll just go back and forth with showing sharing my screen, just to give you some sense of the trajectories. So hopefully you can see this PowerPoint slide, right? So just in the remaining time I have, I'm going to take you through a couple of places. So can you see it?
If you just hit play from start, it'll broaden the screen.
Okay. All right. So that you're not just seeing the tiny little thing here. You got it? Okay. So we're going to go to a couple of places. Is it okay? Can you see it?
I think it's a separate screen that it's popped out to. So if you
stop share, and then let me start share again. Sometimes this occurs when I teach. Now, do you see all the places you'll go? Perfect. Okay. Okay. So this is all the places you'll go: history, family, and race within West Africa and Europe. So I'm going to take you to Senegal. This is my fancy kind of PowerPoint slide here. I circled the places on the map: Senegal, the Ivory Coast, this place called French Equatorial Africa, but also Marseille and Corsica. So in some ways, I like to joke with my students. There's a movie called The Sixth Sense, where this young boy, he says, I see dead people, and these dead people are speaking to him, and he's telling their stories. That's what I do for a living. I feel like the dead are speaking, and they want their stories to be told. As a historian, I feel like I excavate this. And I'm a scholar of French colonial Africa. So the French, as many of you know, in the space right now, in the 20th century, they had these old colonies, but in this 20th century, throughout Africa, colonized parts of Africa and divided them into French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, and there are these different spaces. Morocco was a place aside, Algeria, Tunisia, Madagascar just had these different imaginations. But there was this idea that from Paris, this person called the Minister of Colonies, or this office called the Ministry of Colonies, was going to administer. And this is kind of, I know this is kind of small, but this is kind of the administrative architecture, if you will, of how French power was supposed to be broadcast. But one of the things that occurred, I'm just going to slide forward a little bit, is that in spite of this idea of racial hierarchy, that the French, white, were in a particular place, and then the indigènes, or the natives, who were racialized as Black if you were in sub-Saharan Africa, or Arab if you were in North Africa, were supposed to be these separate entities. People were people, and interracial sexual relationships occurred. So this is kind of the dirty, hidden secret, if you will, of colonialism. And it's hidden, but it's not so hidden in that anywhere in the colonial world, interracial sexual relationships are occurring in spite of the very kind of racialized boundaries. And this is the same if you go to the Americas, Europe, Asia, everywhere. So in a first book that I wrote about called Conjugal Rights, Marriage, Sexuality, and Urban Life in Colonial Libreville, Gabon, I'm always interested in going away beyond from the colonial story to really thinking about kind of the personal lives, the cultural lives, the ways that colonized populations try to build their own histories with efficacy, with dignity. And I'm also interested in this idea of emotional history, getting away from the misery porn of colonialism to really thinking about how people are trying to make their lives. And one of the things that I kept encountering in Gabon when I would go do oral histories, and these two pictures are a way of showing that. So the one on the left is an image that I got from one of the women that I was interviewing. And she's this person on the right-hand side of the picture who's wearing a flower in her hair. And she, when I interviewed her, was 80 years old, and yet she carried this picture for her whole life. And it's a photo of her and a friend and two other friends having a meal with some French naval soldiers in Libreville, Gabon. To say that, we were invited once and we had this dinner and this meal, again, crossing the racial boundaries. So that's one photo that I had. And then the one on the right is an image that someone said to me, and they could identify who the person was, but they said, a woman in my family carried this photo. And what I want you to notice is that child at the bottom is what people would call in French métis, or multiracial, mixed race, as Americanists say. And so I wanted to follow the histories and know about the lives of métis, these people that were not supposed to exist because of the really rigid racial boundaries that were supposed to occur in the French colonial system, in which there was not supposed to be interracial sexuality. So let me just stop sharing screen for a minute to just speak directly to you to say that. So what would occur in French sub-Saharan Africa between 1900 and let's say about 1960, the kind of formal bookends of colonial rule. In French West Africa, about 4,000 to 6,000 métis children, people were born. And in French Equatorial Africa, which was often called the Cinderella of the French Empire in Africa, about 3,000 métis were born. And so these people were a hidden yet public secret. And I can tell you these numbers because even though the French did not want to acknowledge the reality of interracial sexuality, they were tracking Métis. They knew exactly the villages where people lived, the names of the mothers, and also the names of the fathers. The names of the fathers are important because whenever you see a French colonial document, they always talk about the father as the presumed father. And these children could take on their presumed father's last name, but with the French term D-I-T in the front, AKA otherwise known as. So again, it was a public secret who the fathers were, that the relationships had occurred, but officially on any kind of document, you were never supposed to actually write the names of these children. So I wanted to know more about their lives, if you will, to write the history of multiracial Africans. So I have a book that I'm so pleased it's coming out. Can you see the screen? I just want to make sure. Do I need to stop share and share again? Okay, let me do that. And then let me share again. And yes, you can see the screen that has the book cover now, right? Okay, perfect. So I'm so pleased. This book that took me 10 years of research, 10 years of research. And I went to Italy, throughout France, and in 6 former colonies in French West Africa is coming out in June with Cambridge University Press. So I uncover these histories and the lives of these hidden children. So I'll tell you how this came about, though. It came about because of the research that I did in French colonial archives, yes, but also because of the private archives that people gave to me. So I just want to focus on one particular person. So the man to the left of this picture is a person by the name of Nicolas Rigonneau. Rigonneau was born in Dahomey, and this is his mother who's sitting to his right, to his left, I guess, an aunt, and then his brother. Rigonneau was born in Dahomey in the 1930s, or what's known as Benin, migrated to Senegal, and he actually created an association called the Association of Euro-Africans of French West Africa and French Equatorial Africa. And he created this association to find other Métis throughout French Africa, to have an advocacy group, a mutual aid society, to say we exist and we're going to make claims on the French state for financial resources so that children and mothers can raise their children with access to food, access to French schools, and he demanded that children be given French citizenship. So part of the colonial hierarchy was that these children, though they had French fathers, remained indigènes. And there are French laws, though, that say that if a mother who had a child out of wedlock can sue the father for financial resources and also for getting the nationality of the father. But this law was not open to indigènes. So he fought for those rights. And part of the other photo that he showed to me is this photo of the, quote, presumed father, a man by the name of François Rigonneau. And it's because his mother kept this photo, that they had this artifact that they could use to prove paternity. So in many ways, Rigonneau's advocacy got the French to pass this law in the 1930s that said that Métis could sue, could petition, and could get French citizenship. But the ways that they proved their presumed paternity was not through kind of having an excavation where they could prove who their father was, but there are other ways that they could prove that they were French. And this included things like the texture of their hair, their skin color, the name that the mothers gave them, if they had a French name as opposed to an African name. And so when I trace all of these court petitions, there's so many documents that have been pulled out, including the names of the fathers. And there's some documents where the names of the fathers somehow slipped through. But when I met Rigonneau's daughter, he told me that it was her grandmother, Rigonneau's mother, who said, look, I have this photo of this man named François Rigonneau, who's from Corsica. And how else would I have this artifact but for the fact that they had a sexual relationship and this was the father? So there are ways in which the ways in which people themselves built these archives, kept these documents, if you will, that would become evidence. And then one of the other things that I found right when I finished writing this book and I got to go to the archives in Paris, where I had to do this whole process to get these documents to be declassified, is I actually now have a French document. Again, it was a document that was marked confidential, where the French secret police did all these investigations into Rigonneau, where there's now a French document that acknowledges Francois Rigonneau as the father. So in some ways, and then Francois Rigonneau married Pauline Diallo, who herself was Métis. And so the woman in this, a woman, so his wife is the person, I don't know if you can see in the very back of this photo, there's a person marked with an X in the back. So, and I'm just kind of circling her with my cursor here. Pauline Rigonneau, Pauline Diallo, who was Nicolas Rigonneau's wife, herself has a story where she was just left at what the French called orphanages, which were not really orphanages, which were schools that they created to harbor Métis children without formally saying that the French state was responsible for the children. Rather, they farmed out services to missionaries. So she was dropped off and raised in this orphanage by a missionary. And she and Nicolas Rigonneau encountered each other because as a French citizen, he was doing his military service in French Sudan. So these two Métis people who were otherwise orphanages in the French colonial system found each other, married, and created a family, created their own families, whereas officially in the French colonial organization, if you will, they were orphans. And this is a picture of Pauline Rigonneau, elderly, with her daughter, Nicole Sa, who is someone that I was able to literally kind of hunt down by doing all of these searches, and people who know people who know people who know people. And she has preserved these family archives. She has preserved all of these photos. And it's because of her and people like her that I can tell these stories. So to a certain extent, this book was an excavation in colonial and European archives throughout, but also kind of a global journey of interviewing people in their homes. And again, it's through their photos that I was able to kind of piecemeal. So to a certain extent, I had research routes throughout the globe. But I do want to share with you these photos, though, of some archives that I visited in Brazzaville. And Brazzaville is a famous city that's kind of been written out of history because Brazzaville during World War II was the capital city of Free France. Without Brazzaville, this kind of Cinderella or Congo, this Cinderella colony in French Equatorial Africa, saying that we will stand behind you, Charles de Gaulle, France in World War II and the kind of winning over the Nazis would not have occurred. And yet, I want to show you these photos because these are the archives in Brazzaville, and I'll tell you what you're looking at. So when I was there a few years ago, I was so excited because for years and years it was closed. It was because Congo was racked by a civil war. And so I think this was around 2019 or 2018, I want to say, because I was faculty director in France. During one of the vacations, I got a chance to go to Brazzaville. I was so excited to get there. Day one, I had access to the archives. Day two, I came. What you're looking at is a sinkhole. The archives fell into a sinkhole on my second day there. And so I thought, and in the right-hand side picture, there are these red things here. And these are the chairs that were in the archive the day before had now fallen into this sinkhole. So I share this to say that literally doing this kind of research means encountering precarious research situations and the ways in which, through the lack of preservation, that documents and history can literally be lost. But this is a way in which I think the histories won't be lost. And so this is where I think is what I want to talk about, the legacy of my book. So my hope is that through writing this book about these hidden children who were actually a public secret and they grew up to be adults, there's this moment now that many of you may know that started in March 2020 about colonial reckoning. The ways in which former European colonial powers are acknowledging, apologizing for, trying to make amends for colonialism. And part of that has to do with this history. of either taking away mixed race children from their indigenous mothers, or states kind of looking the other way, whereas within their own countries, they had laws where mothers could sue fathers and get financial resources. Because these laws were not open up to colonial subjects, therefore, they also looked the other way and provided no financial resources. So in, I can't remember the year, but in the 21st century, for example, this is a photo of the Belgium minister Charles Michel, who apologized for literally the kidnapping of mixed race children from the Belgian Congo and repatriating back to Belgium. And then the other thing that's occurred in France is there was a documentary that was made during the pandemic called Les Enfants Cachés de la France Coloniale, the hidden children of French colonialism. But they're not hidden, right? People know that they existed. So one of the things that I'm hoping for is that in this documentary, there are some people who are now in their 70s and 80s in Cote d'Ivoire who are saying that we know our biological fathers have estates, they have wealth, and also we are still Ivorian. We do not have French citizenship. So what was fascinating to me is that one of the groups who founded an association of Métis, right, these associations that I write about, actually hired a lawyer. And they want to sue for paternity rights, sue potentially for inheritance rights, sue for the right to gain French citizenship. But they say, when we go to the archives, these documents it's this vicious circle that to prove paternity, you need to have documents, and the archives do not have documents. So one of my hopes in excavating these histories and writing this book is that it opens up this conversation again about 21st century amends, paternity, rights to citizenship, and also in this post-colonial moment. So I can tell you that already I get these kind of messages on LinkedIn and all these things, and people are saying, I'm trying to find out who my father may have been, my grandfather may have been. And so in the same ways that we're having now in the US stories where somebody who was the descendants of a slave owner are having conversations with people who were the descendants of slaves and potentially may actually be blood related because of sexual violence that would occur, the ways that this may open up new stories of possibilities, new global histories of families that are at the intersections of France and Europe, and that continue this kind of global journey through family history. So I'll just stop there for any questions that people may have.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. That was fascinating. Please feel free to put questions in the chat. We do have one in there right now. I don't know if you saw that, Rochelle, from Christina, asking if you're familiar with a book titled Paternity by Nara Milanic. Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, I am not familiar with that book, but I will certainly look it up. And then do you want to tell me more about it, Christina? You're muted.
I'm still reading it off and on, but it's a fascinating study of technology and what paternity, how it was defined over a historical period and what purposes it serves. And it's just incredibly well written. It's with Harvard University Press. And the author came to visit here to UC Davis several years ago. And so she does this study that's, an international study, I think, from Chile to Italy and other countries. So I think you will find some interesting things to consider there. And I'll leave it at that because I haven't read it entirely.
Thank you so much for that. And what's really, because it's global in scale, that'll be very helpful to me.
Mm-hmm.
But what's particular about the French situation is that since the early 20th century, there were laws in place about what the French will call enfants naturels, or natural children, which is children, again, born out of wedlock. There are already these safety nets in place.
Mm-hmm.
And this historian by the name of Rachel Fuchs, who has now passed away, wrote a very big book about paternity in France and how the passage of that law allowed mothers in an era before there was, any kind of DNA testing, a pathway, if you will, to go to court and to prove paternity through things like hearsay, neighborhood testimony, and therefore get resources.
Mhm.
What's fascinating to me, though, is that these legal rights were denied to colonial subjects because, again, of the racial hierarchies.
Mhm.
And that even though towards the late, like the 1950s, once the idea that colonialism was dying and they needed to have more freedoms, a law was promulgated such that colonial subjects could navigate these laws. But there again get to be these barriers because you need to have evidence. And this is something that this lawyer said in that documentary that I mentioned, the hidden children of colonial France, is that the bar, if you will, for legal proof is you need to have evidence. But what happens when the very documents that you need have been removed from the archives? They don't exist in the archives. And even some of these petitions that I'll look at where some people did petition for French citizenship, there is erasure of the names of fathers.
Mhm. Yeah, well, you're going to love this book. Yeah, that's exciting. Your research is fascinating. And I think it keeps history relevant to so many people who would never consider history as an interesting thing because it's so topical to today.
Yeah. So I see that someone else wrote about fascinating work from my oral history research. Did you record your interviews and will they be publicly accessible? So this is tied with Christina's question in that. So I guess I have two things to say. One is, as much as, so I have to be very cognizant about the ethics of the work that I'm doing. And that I think one of the reasons why family history is both really enriching and also very fraught has to do with words such as shame, selfhood, and also advocacy. So to a certain extent, one of the things that I found when I started doing oral histories, so I have the names, as I said, the French were tracking these children who became adults all along. They knew exactly where they were. They knew who the fathers were. And sometimes I have access to these surveys. In the early part of the 20th century, this evidence is much more accessible. And as I get later and later, some of it is just not existent. So I have these lists of all these children who were in the orphanages. And when I would go to a place, I would start, talking with nuns and other people to say, do you know so-and-so still alive? Are there descendants that are still alive? People would say, yes, we know where they lived. And when I would show up, they would say, but I don't want to talk to you. Because there was a particular shame to this history of having been denied recognition by your father. And even though the interracial sexual relationships could be anything from prostitution to sexual violence to relationships that lasted for decades, and people lived together in their relationships of love and marriage like households, but for the fact that legally they could not be marriage. So it is a race against time. Yeah, people are getting older. So to a certain extent, I should say there were a lot of people who did not want to talk to me. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with me at all. And so the people who would agree to talk with me, I was just so grateful for them in the ways that they wanted to speak and to tell their histories. And they would, again, take out these boxes and say, oh my gosh, we've got this picture of this document. So I'm grateful for them. However, when I went back to France last summer for the first time, since the pandemic, there was one informant that by that point I had page proofs, and my book is going to be translated in French. That's the other thing that absolutely not. This is not just for an English audience. I want it to be in conversation with people in Senegal and also in France. That's the audience that I really want to reach, to know this hidden history. So I told her what was going in the book. And these were her words. These were things that she said. And she paused and she said, I said that? Oh my goodness. I don't know if I want that to get out there because it could have repercussions for me. I don't want to be harassed. And so, ethically I had to think about it, but there's a way in which it's in page proofs. We had an agreement, whatever, I can't do this, but maybe for the French version, I can do X, Y, Z, that people's lives are at stake. So actually, I will not make the oral interviews publicly accessible without people's without people's consent, and without people getting the chance to see if they want to change their names. Because one of the things that I also did is I changed some names in the book where people said, I don't want to be identified, because these are still current day histories. And then I'll tell you one more thing that I also found out. So I'm writing a paper now. As you know, when you write a book, with all the stuff that doesn't gotta get in. But I'm writing a paper right now for this workshop that I'm going to do in New York. And in doing current history and just kind of putting together 2 and 2 with names, one of the people that I'm writing about in this paper, I publicly know who the presumed father is, a very public person, has a very public persona in France. And so now I have all these documents, because the documents, there's this process called dérogation in French that you have to go to kind of get public access. So because the documents were closed until 2018. So now I have access to them. This person just died 4 years ago. I know where their children are. And so again, there are all these ethical considerations. I'm going to write about this family, but they're still alive. What reverberations are that going to have? That I don't know. So I think I just see CHUN felt, if you want to go ahead and ask your question. So the person with their hand raised, go ahead.
Yes, I was muted. So I find your research fascinating. And what triggers my mind is the deepness of colonial situations. No, I mean, you're talking about colonialism literally in the bedroom. So I have been working on the Andes, and I'm with UC San Diego as a historian. And what I see happening is what happens in the 19th century. That is how much people fight in courts, in court cases about paternity and about legitimacy and bastardy. I mean, it is, and also the mestizo situation, the métis that you were mentioning, is a very rampant composition of the multiracial societies we have in most of South America, but particularly in the Andean region. No? So I was wondering how far deep does this colonial relationship go in the case of the Belgian Congo? Is there any change that comes with the colonial situation? What was there before? I mean, do you have any clue of how colonialism itself changed the marital relationships and the love relationships and the personal relationships that you have been digging so deeply into? Thank you for your presentation, Rachel. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah, so so your question takes me back to the first book that I wrote, which was about marriage and sexuality in Gabon in particular. And so both for people who are, quote, métis, and then also people who are Africans of varied other racial and ethnic identity, colonialism had deep impact. And the thing that's fascinating about colonialism is it actually only lasted for a generation and a half, right? And at this point, now that many African countries have already celebrated beyond 50 years of independence, in another 20 years will be 100 years post-colonialism. And yet the impact is so, again, so very, very deep and so very profound. So I guess I'll answer the 2 parts of your question, one about the kind of historical routes. So we know that as early as there was contact, whether it was contact around trade or the Atlantic slave trade or colonialism, in spite of these ideas about racial hierarchy, which is at the core of colonialism, or ideas about superiority, inferiority, or separation, sex across the color national lines always occur. And that they're asymmetrical in that there are times in which, I'll talk more about women involved in interracial sexual relationships, or definitely there's an asymmetrical power relationship. But there's also a way in which involvement in interracial sexual relationships also offers some women involved in these relationships up and down the coast of West Africa, Southern Africa, Madagascar, access to resources that actually allow them to raise their rank. So I'll answer that with, so somebody, I remember once a reviewer wrote about the way that I write, it's almost as if my historical actors are my children or people who I love deeply. And I think that is absolutely the case. I fall in love with the people that I write about, and I want to do such justice to them in telling their stories. And so the person I wrote about in an article that was published in the Journal of Women's History was about a person named Flavie Ndiaye. I loved this person to death because she was a Métis woman who got into a fight on the streets of Libreville in the 1930s with a white French police commissioner. And then she gets into a fight days later with a Black man from Libreville, because the white police commissioner tries to say, you're nothing, you're not a white woman, how dare you pass as a white woman? And then the Black male resident of Libreville that she gets into a fight with says, you're just a woman. How dare you try to be, any higher than me? I'm a man, you're below me. And so in some ways, I think part of what my stories are saying, though, that there's also nuance, right? So that it is black and white, and yet it is not black and white. It is very, very complex. And so I think the thing that I've done more and more is I want to look at the deep impact of colonialism, the deep impact of Europe, but you also have to look equally closely at intra-African relations. And Africa and Africans are not monolithic. So in the Gabon case, and I know much more so than the Congo case, it's about the ways in which, all these various ethnic groups like Mpongwe, Fon, and the same thing for the Belgian Congo, intersectionality, which is what Christina is writing. And also the ways in which I don't want to write this idea of Africa as somehow being utopia. There are no asymmetrical relationships of power within ethnic groups, right? And the ways in which the colonial situation also gets to be a way for varied ethno-language groups to get different kinds of resources, different access to power, such that they're able to control or have power over another ethno-language group also. So it's both of those. And so again, thinking about the things that don't go in the book, I wrote another really shorter article about this custody dispute between a woman from the Côte d'Ivoire and a French man. So I'm really interested in microhistories and writing these small histories, family histories, because I want to tell the emotion. So colonialism is also not just about power and violence. It's also about French men being vulnerable. Also trying to buttress against the kind of rigid racial hierarchies and themselves also being powerless at times also. And then I just see a question in the chat about how many people are living and passing as non-Métis and are they worried? Love that question. So because this person who I'm writing about for this workshop, whose documents were just open to the public in 2019, and who now through the power of Google search, I know the father man was actually a very famous person. He won a medal from the Légion, the organization that de Gaulle founded. So he was an army captain that supported de Gaulle, got all these medals and whatnot. And the fascinating thing to me is when you read all of the documents, so what happened is he actually recognized his children and brought them to France. And so because he recognized his children, then they were legally French. But when you look at all of the genealogies online, the mother is listed as his French wife. So the two mothers from one was from Belgian Congo, one was from Congo Brazzaville, are just erased from history. So what I wonder is in him going to France and the children become his children and his wife become their legal parent, they erase the African mothers from the story. And for me, what I want to know is, do the children, because they came when they were very young, do they know this? And I don't know physiologically what they look like, if they're passing as white or what have you, or any of that story. If I don't know what the story was, did the parents just say, oh, we adopted you from the Congo? Do they know all of this? So again, these are all kind of ethical things I have to think about, because the descendants of Flavie Ndiaye that I wrote about in a different article actually wrote to me once, and they said, we're her descendants. We now live in the US. So at the same time, it doesn't stop me from what I'm doing, because I do want my stories to have an impact in terms of, again, people being able to talk about their family histories and telling them fully. but I do think about the ways in which, you know, how some people take a 23andMe DNA test and they find out that, you know, these things that they didn't know, their father is not really their biological father kind of thing. I think some of these things will occur, but that's just history, right? Yeah, Jeanne d'Arc.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation and insight into the life of those that live among us, and we don't know some of those really interesting aspects of our life. As you were interviewing the Métis, I wonder if you could talk about any insight you might get regarding their life or how they were living their identities as Métis in maybe an environment where they might be viewed or perceived as privilege. So how were they living in that environment, those that, I guess, biracial identity?
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I should tell you that in the end, even though my book surveyed all of French West and all of French Equatorial Africa, and what I thought was going to be really small became like almost a 400-page book, which was amazing. I didn't think I had that in me, but there it was. I focused in particular on 3 locations. So I focused on Senegal, Gabon, and then what we know of today's Congo Brazzaville. So not the Belgian Congo. And what I found was that it depends. And the it depends part was not, it didn't depend on French colonialism. Rather, it depended on the local factors. So this is not a story that is being driven by France. So in a place like Gabon, where the Gabonese are spécial, as many people say, Gabon, people there are really proud of saying, we were a part of France before Nice was a part of France. So in Gabon, where people are speaking Parisian French everywhere, and there's a kind of a whittling away of Gabonese languages, Métis certainly held a very high standard on the socioeconomic ladder. And I will never forget when I was there for research in my first book, maybe 10 years ago, I was walking through the city trying to find this person that someone had told me that I should interview, who was Métis. And if any of you have been to any kind of cities in Africa, you know that there are, no street names or whatever. You're just supposed to say, oh, I'm looking for, this landmark, and I think the house, ... So I went around saying, I'm looking for a person, her name is ... and she's Métis. No one could find her. No one could tell me where this house was. And finally, when I started talking to somebody, he says, oh, you mean La Blanche, the white woman. Why didn't you just say you were looking for the white woman? So this is a way in which I was speaking about her in a certain way, but in her society, in her town, they were referring to her as the white woman. So that's a Gabon particularity, and it has to do with the fact that there was one particular ethnic group along the coast that engaged the most in interracial relationships and really used these to also set themselves apart from other populations. So there's definitely also, I talk about intra-African racism also, because there are definitely some Métis who saw themselves as better than, they are not Africans, they are not Black. So that is the case in Gabon. In a place like the Congo, though, there is this man by the name of Henri Lopez, who was one of the first prime ministers of independent Congo, who himself is Métis. And he has this wonderful book where he talks about ma grand-mère Bantu, mon grand-père français, my Bantu grandmother, my French grandfather. And he writes in this book that he is a child of both, and he's going to have both identities. And he was one of the rare Métis who continued in politics in post-independence. Métis tend to be in more of these kind of niche professional professions, but not so much in politics, with the exception of Ghana. Jerry Rawlings was actually Métis. So I was just saying in the French setting. So in the Congo, in Brazzaville, because there are these 2 cities, Brazzaville and Leopoldville, or Kinshasa, are across a river from each other, and there's a lot of back and forth. People think of themselves as both identities. And so oftentimes Métis are joining in the independent struggles of Black Congolese, because they say we are part of these struggles. So we have our own kind of things that we're fighting for, and we're part. Yes, and Trevor Noah's book is also really fascinating about that because Trevor Noah, as poet mentioned, talks about himself as a chameleon. So I would say in the Congo, Henri Lopez was that chameleon where he says, depending on where I am, I'm Métis, I'm Black, I'm French, and I'm Congolese, all at the same time. And again, that had to do more with the local politics. In a place like Senegal, where it tended to be people of all kinds of varied ethnic groups, and you had a person like Leopold Senghor, the poet, first leader, who Black, Catholic, he spoke of himself as Métis. He says, all Senegalese, we have all been touched by métissage in that I adhere to, I'm French, and I believe also in négritude, Black culture, they're on the same plane. So for him, métissage was not a racialized term, it was around mixing of culture. So because of that, what I found in Senegal is you often had, quote, Black Senegalese who were also advocating for Métis children to have access to citizenship, to have access to resources, because for them, that was part of the entire campaign to have Senegalese gain rights overall. And they would always say, if the French can't even give rights to people who have French blood, who are the actual literal biological children of the French, how will they ever actually give rights to all Africans? So I think one of the things that I'm arguing against, there is this whole French literature about what scholars call le problème métis, the métis problem. There's a huge literature about this in French scholarship. It starts from Haiti, this idea that, oh, the métis people, they're really dangerous because they could revolt against us. They are déracinés, as the French would say, and they're pathological is also the sense, because they're nowhere, there's actually something wrong with them mentally. And then people like Emmanuel Sada, who's a scholar, wrote a book about les métis entre subjection and citoyenneté, métis between subjection and citizenship, about métis in Indochina. Laura Ann Stoller, who's an anthropologist, has also written a lot also about the métis problem, but they're always writing it from the French colonial perspective. I wanted to write the history of what métis themselves are thinking about their identities and the way in which Jeanne d'Arc, as you've mentioned, they live out these multiracial identities in Africa and in France. Yeah. Can I just,
you.
yeah. Other questions? Okay, so another internal hierarchies, material claims, and ultimately CISO versus biological. Bye, Christina. Thanks. Nice to see you. I do think there are changing self-identities. Absolutely. And I don't think it's internal colonial, because again, this is not a story. See, what I'm arguing against, there is this idea in French colonial history, and I would say in French history, and I do think it comes from Haiti. This idea that Métis people are out of sorts. So they're all, when you read all of this medical literature, there are these ideas of the pathology, because they don't belong anywhere, because their fathers haven't recognized them and they don't quite belong in African or indigenous societies. Again, whether you're talking about Haiti or Africa or Madagascar or Indochina, that there's something psychologically wrong with Métis and they don't know where they are. That's one. The other thing that the French talk about is Métis somehow are feeble. They're not able to have children. Their fertility has been racked by the actual being Métis, being multiracial is somehow biologically something so wrong that they also can't actually reproduce. So there are all this pseudoscientific medical literature about Métis having lower fertility rates than other people. So I'm arguing against this because there is this idea of internal colonialism, that somehow being multiracial itself is pathological. And this is something that Paulette, I'm so glad that you brought out the Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, because he argues against that. So for him, if anything, it is his superpower in the way that I just identified, because he talks about this ability to be a chameleon. In this society in South Africa, that would say that you are literally a crime. There's something wrong with you. He talks about it, that the fact that he speaks Afrikaans can overcome race depending on where he is. And so what I'm finding is that people are not pathological, they're not psychologically damaged, and they are invoking all these identities in a way that pushes back against French colonial racial hierarchies and also African racial hierarchies that would say the only identity that exists in sub-Saharan Africa that is somehow liberatory is Black. So one of the things that I talk about in the later chapters as we get to the 1960s, where all this idea of Pan-Africanism is around Blackness and African independence is around Blackness. People are saying, I am multiracial and I am African. And this idea that to be multiracial is also African is also there. It's not just Black identity or Arab identities, which also exist there. But can I just end by I just want to share my screen one more sec and tell you about my new project, which just kind of ends this kind of global journey. And I think I need to stop share and then share again because you probably can't see it. Do you see this photo that comes from, it says Cap Haïtien, local and global. So as a Haitian who doesn't do Haitian history, I have to say, I've been running away from Haiti my whole life, and that people wanted to typecast me and say, well, you're Haitian, you must do Haitian history. But now I am finally coming full circle. So in the movie Wakanda Forever, Cap Haïtien features, and that's the town where I'm from. It's where my family is from. And so this is a picture of Lupita Nyong'o in that movie. Kind of, she's in an ocean somewhere in the city of Cap Haïtien. Cap Haïtien was the capital of Saint-Domingue when it was, for a little while, when it was the colony of France, and it was the first capital of the Kingdom of Haiti for a couple of years when it was the Kingdom of Haiti. And in this movie, which is supposed to be about a Black utopia, Pan-African future in a place where there's no colonialism and technology, this town features. And so this is just an aerial view of Cap Haïtien. So I'm interested in writing not a misery porn story of Haiti is always crisis. It's a revolution or crisis. I want to write a biography of the city where my family is from, the city that stands in the 21st century for this possible Black utopia, and also at some point was the Paris of the Antilles, was the first capital city of independent Haiti, to see how over time, also with just these kind of, there's a global story and a local story about the ways in which people are fighting to live their lives, even in the shadow of crisis and colonialism. So I am going to go back to these multiple identities and go back to this Haitian set and in writing this next project.
Well, thank you so much, Rochelle. There was so much information. It was fascinating. I look forward to reading your book and your future projects on the history of your hometown in Haiti. So thank you, everyone. We will be sending out the link to the recording, and we can also include some of those links to Rochelle's research and books. And if you have any questions, I'm sure you can just shoot them out to Bryn and I at alumni@ucap.edu. University of California.edu.
Yeah, thank you, all of you.
Yeah, and we will make sure that Rochelle gets them. And again, thank you again for your time today. And we look forward to seeing you at our next UCEAP Presents.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for attending.
Bye.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much for
Thank you
that.
so much.
That was wonderful.
Really, really appreciated it.
Yeah,
I
thank
think
you so
people
much.
were really fascinated, and I didn't, having spent a little bit of time with you in Ireland, and to get to hear what you work on, this is really interesting. So
Yeah, thank you for this opportunity.
yeah,
Thank you. All right, bye.
bye.